Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm your host, Doug Stuart. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that we have Alex Nowrasteh, who is Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Washington Post, and many other publications in the U.S. And Alex actually regularly appears on places like Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, NPR, numerous television and radio stations. He's humbly coming to the Libertarian Christian Podcast because he knows how important our audience is. And back in May, I got to meet Alex in person for the first time because Jacob Winograd and I attended the Soho Forum debate where Alex debated Dave Smith on the topic of immigration, which is going to be what we're talking about today. So Alex, I don't know about you, but do you ever get tired of talking about this? Because it's sometimes the same argument over and over. My personality, I don't know if I could handle it.
I don't really get tired of it because the circumstances keep changing, right? So the facts that are behind it, that are up to date, the policies of the government keep changing. So the background issue is always the same. And I think the principles are the same, which are, individual liberty, limited government, free markets, peace. These principles are all the same. And these are the ones that I've devoted my career toward trying to advance. So no, I don't get sick of it. It's fun. And the other thing that's fun about it is you get to talk a lot about American history, which is really a blast to do because it's so interesting and different than most other countries. And the history of immigration here has been it's so important and so interesting, so deep.
Yeah, well, I want to talk a little bit about how those changing conversations have happened over the course of the last decade or so, especially. But before that, I actually was alerted to the fact that you were recently before Congress, before, I guess, Congressman Tiffany, and I forget the other person you said, whoever it was. And I just wanted to get a little, get your take on the experience there. I mean, obviously there's prep that goes into it. Some of that is just grabbing data and knowing, who your audience is and so forth. But I have to say, as somebody just watching these clips on YouTube, it seems extremely frustrating to me to watch them just kind of talk over you, but you're never allowed to talk back or talk over them. And I'm just like, is there anybody who's like, I don't know, the sass can't go both directions. And I don't know, is that like not allowed? Would you just not be invited back on? Because you were so polite and nice and whatever, but like, I don't know, what's that experience like?
So I got invited. It's the House Judiciary Committee and a subcommittee to testify on visa security, basically, which is a pretty boring topic. And a lot of prep goes into it, a couple of days worth of work, writing on my written testimony. And then I speak for 5 minutes up there. And then they ask me questions. They each get 5 minutes. All the congressmen and members of Congress get 5 minutes to ask me who are on this committee about basically whatever they want. Very little oversight. And yeah, they get pretty upset. Sometimes they like to yell at me, especially they like to, question my motives, all this stuff. And I give it back pretty hard. I give back basically what I get. So, and some of those clips from the other day, it was Representative Tiffany from Wisconsin, Representative Chip Roy from Texas, and a few others who are fairly critical. And the thing is, I was invited by the Democrats to be their witness. And they could basically invite anybody they want to. But they also know that the other side can invite anybody they want to, right? So there's this sort of like cooperative sense of it. So I think if I were like very, very rude and like way beyond the scope and bounds of what's allowed, I definitely wouldn't be invited back.
Okay.
But there are sort of norms about these things. Like you understand what you can say like on television, even if it's not like illegal. Like there are bounds to this type of thing, right? So I actually didn't think it was that bad. And the thing like to notice when watching these debates on TV or in Congress or whatever is it's a lot more intense from the audience's perspective. Than it is from the participants' perspective. It just seems more combative, I think, from the outside than from the inside.
Yeah. Okay. No, I see that. I mean, I think a lot of us are, especially libertarians, are rooting for like the Tony Stark commandeer their computers and say, I just privatize world peace. Like that would just be kind of like the rah-rah moment that we're all looking for. But I've been increasingly interested in watching these interactions because it just makes my opinion of Congress people just lower and lower in the way that they treat the common folk, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing to recognize about this is most hearings are just for show. It's to give an example.
What are they allegedly for, though? Like, I realize that's what's happening. We kind of identify that. But what do they think they're doing it for?
Well, they're supposed to be doing it to get information, to inform the bills they're writing or decisions they're making.
Okay. And do you think it's just a waste of time in a real sense? Or is it really just, well, Congress has to do this, so let's make a show of it?
I think it's about 95% just for show.
Okay.
Every once in a while, they do have hearings about topics they don't really know anything about, and they learn stuff. But a lot of those
seems
are
to me like they're
private.
Always having hearings about things they don't know anything about.
Well, that's true, but they don't necessarily learn things, right?
Yeah.
So every once in a while, I think that does happen.
Yeah.
But a lot of those are like the really boring ones. So that nobody's interested in.
Yeah. Okay. Are they different off camera? I mean, did you and Congressman Tiffany have an exchange that was a lot more polite looking to the average person later, or in that, maybe not that in particular person, but a general sense? I mean, does there seem to be this show aspect of this situation versus the like, hey, when you're in a private room, you guys are all cordial and everything?
The way that so let me put it this way, like people do put on a little bit more of a show for the cameras, but it's close. The way that they behave is pretty closely correlated to their personalities. So like you just cannot act consistently, I think, for years in a way that's like very different than who you actually are. So a lot of them, like Chip Roy, for instance, gets very loud up there. It's not an act. Like he gets angry and very angry very quickly, but he also calms down very quickly. And that, I think, is just his personality. So it's not personal. Like I don't take it personally.
Yeah, I can imagine it doesn't. It's one of those things where you have to go in either learning to never take it personally or just knowing that you're not going to be able to. So
yeah, and then it's like, well, you should do something else with your career. Like,
that's true. This would not be my career because I would just be back talk all the time. And then I would never be, not when I say all the time, it'd be like the first time and then never again. That would be me. That would be my thing. All right. Well, I wanted to get your take on that. Thank you for sharing that experience, and thank you for testifying and giving some information. It was fun to hear you say that. Well, some things are good, some things are bad about the Biden administration, which is a question I want to ask you here in a little bit. And then he just didn't like that because it was just like you need to say everything is my way.
Well, like the thing that I said to him was like, listen, I don't talk in talking points. I don't think in talking points.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a politician.
It's so weird to me because, like, you ask somebody, it's like, you ask a personal friend where it's like, so how's your marriage going? And be like, oh, yeah, it's mostly good. There's a few bad things about it. That's an honest and truthful answer. But when you say, how's the immigration system going? It's like, it has to be all good or all bad, or you're just a shill, or you're just a grifter. And it's just maddening. So anyway, all right. I got my anger out by asking you these questions. Recent history. I'm glad you said you like to talk about American history, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't take into account when understanding sort of the history of the immigration debate. Especially the things like Ellis Island immigration or Ellis Island policy, those kinds of things. And so I'm really glad that you want to talk about history. I want to start in this conversation a little bit with like the last 10 years, or maybe a little bit. We can kind of go back to like the beginning of the Obama administration. It seems like the debate over immigration has shifted pretty dramatically from George Bush being pretty pro-immigration, and now we have a Republican president who's very anti-immigration. And so, what shifts have you seen in the country? And yeah, let's just start with that. What shifts have you seen in the country over the conversation about the topic itself?
Well, for the first time, I think at least in my career, we see large numbers of people who want to reduce legal immigration. Before that, you always had this idea that, well, illegal immigration is bad, but legal immigration is good. And I think most people still think that, but you see large numbers of people who just like want to cut legal immigration. And that's new. And that's different. And you see it with Stephen Miller, Donald Trump. I mean, Trump's biggest accomplishment in his first term was, his accomplishment from his perspective. was cutting legal immigration. So you see that all the time. And then I know like you're probably already going to get fan mail or hate mail saying like, nobody's against legal immigration. I'm like, yeah, okay, well, look at the deputy policy advisor and director for the president of the United States. He does. Look at the vice president of the United States. He does. The president of the United States does. Look at like most Republican members of Congress. They do. So like, I just have no tolerance for that anymore because it's such like a patriotically correct statement that is now about 10 years out of date.
So people saying, well, I'm for legal immigration. The number of those people are actually declining.
I think so. At least the share of those people definitely is declining, right?
Yeah.
Especially on the right.
Yeah. So that's one big change that you've seen.
Yeah, I think another one is, a lot of the sort of like political coalitions that are on different sides have definitely shifted around a bit. So, like in the 2024 election, it looks like the evidence that we have, and it's not definitive, but the evidence looks pretty good that Donald Trump probably won the immigrant vote in 2024. Not by a lot, but by like a point or two. So that's really interesting and different. And it looks like he basically split the Hispanic vote in the U.S., which includes native-born Americans of Hispanic descent and also immigrants with Democrats. So this idea that like demographics is some kind of like huge destiny that's going to propel us toward a free immigration future or Democratic Party dominance is just obviously like not true.
My gut sense is that the Hispanic vote probably went for Trump. This is, I think, the answer that a lot of people, the explanation a lot of people use to say, oh, it probably went for them because, well, they got in line and they're the ones that are looking at the people trying to sort of skip line, the skip line argument, and they don't want any more of that. Is there anything to that, or is it still too early to know?
I think it's I think the answer is like kind of related to that. But I think it's just that they don't like chaos. And you look at border chaos, nobody likes things that are like out of control and wild and like disorderly. And they see that and they're like, well, I don't like that. So I'm going to vote against it.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically it for most people.
So then that just brings us to the Biden administration. I settled this in my own mind about, well, what's the right policy or what's the right libertarian position on this topic. Free movement of people is the libertarian position. You and I would agree on that, of course. And so I kind of ignored what was happening. I was always against what Trump was doing in his first term, clearly against what he's doing in his second term here on this topic in particular. And I didn't really think much about or pay much attention to what was going on in the Biden administration. Probably neither did Joe Biden. But during that time, there was an immigration policy. You said, and as you testified before Congress, that there were good things and there were bad things. Is the view that the Biden administration messed up the immigration situation so much that, one, it gave the rise to Trump, and that's kind of a separate question, but was it so bad that everybody's like, yeah, we got a lot of reasons to be really frustrated with what Biden did? What's the record on Biden? I guess that's really what the heart of here is.
So, I mean, I think the reason why people were mad at Biden on immigration is just that the border was out of control. So I don't think people were really upset about the legal system changes that he did, expansion of legal immigration, or the parole programs that allowed some people from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Haiti to come in lawfully and work. What I think they're upset about is they saw the border was totally out of control. You had some months when there were 250,000 people apprehended along the border, or 250,000 apprehensions along the border. And everybody hates that. And I understand why they hate that. And so that, I think, is what they really messed up. And what they really didn't do much to try to fix or resolve until the last year of his administration. They did quite a lot to resolve it. And they largely succeeded even before Trump came into office. But it was too late to do that. Like we had
the sentiment was there. Yeah,
we had 3 years of just like really bad, out of control chaos along the border, and not all of it is Joe Biden's fault, right? But a good amount of it is, and that reverberated negatively to his party's political defeat in 2024.
Was it a concerted effort to treat the border as if it should be open, or was it just classic mismanagement? I think that's part of the question here, because like Trump would probably blame it on, and a lot of people even who kind of shifted from the left to the right, realizing that the left wants open borders for demographic change reasons, things like that. I know Elon Musk threw out that during the campaign. But I can imagine that the Biden administration just did something poorly, or was it just Well, what was the reason?
Incompetence. I mean, it was just like rank incompetence. They did some liberalization in just like really bad ways and some bad order. So, for instance, they made it a lot easier to apply for asylum.
Okay.
It was like the first thing they did, and I'm like, okay, well, you're going to get a lot of people then that come right to the border, and they did that before they made it possible for people to come. More people to come legally from abroad and from a distance, right? So as a result, you have like all these people show up at the border, a lot more people. They have a legal claim to make for asylum, and it's just like this messy, disorderly process. And then, and this is a good thing, was they had there was a labor market, a very large demand for workers in the United States. The post-COVID recovery was very strong in the economy and the labor market. But immigration wasn't liberalized that much. So as a result, you have all these other people coming up for job market reasons all of a sudden. And they didn't make it possible for them to come on other visas. And so you have that all of a sudden. And then the government is just totally flat-footed from all these things happening at once, that they never really get it under control. They never really work well with Mexico to try to help to get things under control. And they sort of don't really care that much for a couple of years, hoping that it'll go back to normal, and it really didn't. And they were focused on other things they wanted to do, like the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, that they did get like distracted from inflation, which was a major, huge issue. And so, and then the environmental nonsense they did, and the stimulus bill. So like they got distracted with all this crap that made the economy worse in some ways from the border. And by the time and then the 2022 election wasn't that good for Republicans, the midterm election. So they probably thought they were a little safe. And then they let things fester.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that stuck with me was that they allowed it easier for asylum seekers to get here, or to get through the process, I guess. Is that what that was?
Yeah, so the thing is, under asylum, you have to be on U.S. soil to ask for it, but it doesn't matter if you're legally here or illegally here. Okay. So it gives an incentive for people to cross the border illegally. Then they can ask for asylum. Right. And then that means that they have, a legal claim, which will take years to go through. And then in the meantime, they can work. So if you're not allowed to come into the U.S. lawfully, you use the asylum system. Even if you have a bad claim, it takes years to sort out. And in the meantime, you're here and able to work legally.
Okay. Gotcha. So you're saying that actually would have adverse effects, since that was the first thing that they liberalized. Okay. Yeah. So they have that problem, and then all the other descriptive problems like inflation and so forth that you talked about. And so it got out of hand. So, okay. So
and then the idea, by the way, that they somehow wanted insane chaos, which hurts them politically, which they know hurts them politically from day one, is just, there's no good political theory to think why that would be true. Like presidents generally don't want chaos because it's them.
I don't want to venture into this line of questioning too much, but it seems like there could be a reason. And I know that this is sometimes the reason that anti-immigration or lower immigration people are spouting. So it's somewhere in that vicinity, that there are going to be powerful figures pushing for this sort of chaos because they don't care which side is getting hurt. They're going to win either way. Sort of immigration industrial complex sort of applied. I mean, is there anything to that?
So like who would these people be?
Well, I guess you could say there'd be big corporations who want inexpensive labor. They don't care that Joe Biden's the one who's going to take the rap for it, because by the time that's over, they're already going to have these people. They may not have understood what ICE is going to be doing under the Trump administration, but they hedge their bets, and they're okay with the chaos. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there's an argument similar to like the military industrial complex doesn't care whether Democrats or Republicans negotiate wars or start wars, because they're going to make money no matter what.
Right, but Democrats and Republicans like to start wars because it's good for them. A lot of times, and but I just don't see the argument for why like Joe Biden would go along with it.
Oh, I don't think. Well, it's hard to use him as an example because he wasn't going along. I mean, he was. Sorry, it's so hard to not understand it. But yeah, no,
like
I get
his
what
administration
you mean.
though, like why would the people who would lose politically go along with that?
Well, they wouldn't know that they're losing. They just think that they're, like you said, in 22, America seems fine with what we're doing, and so they just kind of go along with what's happening. I'm not saying that argument is really important, but I do know that this whole like there are big corporations and I guess George Soros, and there's the history of I guess Russia using mass immigration to build up territories over decades. That kind of strategy is the kind of thing that they're going to care. Those people are going to couldn't care less which president gets flack.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very different theory than the sort of Joe Biden and his administration doing it, right? That's a different thing. So, undoubtedly, companies, people who are property developers, lots of people who want to marry immigrants, right? Like lots of people support it for very different reasons. Like in the 19th century, the battle cry of nativists was, Jews, Jesuits, and steamships were the big three lobbies who they criticize as being supportive of immigration, right? And, there's people who support it, there's people who oppose it. But ultimately, it's a chaotic, when the government's so deeply involved, it's just a chaotic mess.
Yeah. Do you think that the stigma of the phrase of the term open borders is now a little bit too much for libertarians to use? Like it seems like it was. You always thought it was.
I always thought it was.
What's your preferred word?
I like free immigration.
Okay. How's that any different other than just the stigma of the word?
Because I think open implies like nothing, like no checks, like, it's like, as free as you like walking across your house, right? Like, or across your front door. Whereas I think free immigration, like free trade is like, yeah, you can go, you can do it. But I just don't think it has the stigma as being like totally open, totally whatever happens, totally chaotic.
Okay. So it's less prone to be misunderstood too as a term. Yeah. Okay.
And it's used by, and I think the good metric of this is it's used by the opponents. The term open borders is used by its opponents. And so that's usually a good measure of whether it's effective or not. Whereas free trade is...
Yeah, but so is capitalist, though.
Yeah, but capitalism doesn't have like such a negative... capitalism is used by both sides all the time.
Okay.
Whereas I don't see too many people who are like mainstream-ish folks saying, like basically nobody's saying open borders.
Okay,
right?
I see.
But, like,
I see.
trade,
it's more pejorative in common parlance to say open borders.
Yeah. Meanwhile, like free trade, like everybody says free trade. Right? Like everybody says capitalism. Everybody says, these other different terms.
Yes. Right. Okay.
So it's fine. It's more descriptive, and I think it's more neutral sounding.
Yeah. Okay. No, I can understand that. So the one attitude that I think is I want to say different, but when I was becoming a libertarian and understanding some of these issues and realizing, and this is a phrase you have. By the way, I haven't brought up your book here. I have here called
thanks.
"Wretched Refuse: The Political Economy of Immigration Institutions" by Alex and Benjamin Powell. Man, dude, it's a lot of data in here. There's a lot of information, and you start off with basically like the welfare of global citizens is sort of, Art Carden said it was a slam dunk. When you do the math on it, the welfare of global citizens is just going to go up. I know Brian Kaplan wrote a whole book about how the welfare, and I'm going to use that phrase, the welfare of global citizens. That's a phrase you use in the book. I'm worried that the America First movement, whether you're a hardcore MAGA type or whether you're just kind of a Thomas Massey America First kind of person, a lot of people don't care about the welfare of the global citizens. They see globalization and cosmopolitanism as somewhat of a threat to the well-being of the U.S. So what do you do when you're arguing with people who kind of don't care about that metric?
I almost never bring up that metric.
Oh, really?
For that reason, because nobody cares. I think it's true. And I think it's something that people should care about.
Okay.
And I think it's something that, that in an ideal world would matter a lot. But nobody really cares. So
Okay.
like, I just don't bring it up.
Okay, maybe you and I are in different circles, because for me as a Christian, bringing that up to a community of believers that think globally already, think missions, think all that kind of, global church, we're all brothers in Christ, under the Lord, all of that kind of thing is sort of an ethos that Christians ought to embrace. And so maybe that has a little bit more purchase in the people that I'm trying to argue with into this position. So interesting. That's good that you probably don't bring that up, because, you're right. It's sort of like asking somebody to care about the Constitution when they're like, yeah, I'm a progressive. I don't care. Or no, sorry, not the Constitution, the founders. Well, the founders said, and like, dude, you're talking to a progressive. They don't care.
Yeah. So I don't bring up the founders as much as I used to, because I found that people don't care about them as much as they used to. Right? Like even conservatives.
Right.
And so I don't lie, but I do use different arguments with different audiences, because some people care a lot about equality, legal equality, for instance. So I will emphasize that. A lot of people are very interested in American tradition, so I'll emphasize that with other ones. Other ones are interested in free markets. Or classically liberal values, right? And I'll bring those up in different audiences. Some are interested in all of them combined. And there are arguments for each of these, and I don't think they're contradictory. I don't really think they contradict each other.
Yeah, right.
Maybe they do sometimes, but not that often. And so I'm very comfortable without. I don't feel like I need to use every argument with every audience.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Well, that actually brings me to a little bit, and I don't want to. We don't need to like regurgitate the whole debate that you had with Dave Smith, although I do want to talk a little bit about that. But that was one thing that I think it often does. It's often missing in libertarians when we debate this particular issue, actually any issue, but this particular issue. And that's the difference between when we're using rhetoric and when we're talking from principles. So, for example, the fact that the global welfare of citizens actually goes up as a data point, you could be 100% right, but is that the right principle? Are kind of two different questions. And so, in my mind, to say something like, well, hey, the welfare of global citizens are going to be better, or culture is going to be better, or, your selection of food in the cities are going to be better, whatever people care about, is a rhetorical device or a rhetorical strategy to convince them that, oh, immigrants aren't so bad, or, oh, yeah, we should be really welcoming of immigrants because they make America great, or whatever the angle might be, versus the sort of using principles to be like, okay, look, the libertarian principle is this, freedom of movement. And I thought Dave kind of missed out on the fact that when you bring up data, it's not like, oh, well, that's why it's the right libertarian answer. It's like, this is why you should be okay with it. Is that roughly in the right direction on how to parse that out?
I think so. I put it like a little bit differently in the debate, right? It's like we have our principles as libertarians.
Right.
But principles aren't the only thing that matters. We also need to look at the consequences. And I think if you and I became convinced that libertarianism led to, say, like poverty, right? Like extreme poverty. I don't think it does. I think it's the opposite. But let's say you and I became convinced of that. We may not change our principles because they may be just ethically, for other reasons, very important. But we might change it. Like if the consequences of what we wanted were really, really bad in some way. Like let's say the consequences of liberty would be within 200 years, humans would be extinct.
Hard to know ahead, but sure.
Hard to know ahead, but let's say we became pretty convinced of that through argument and some evidence. I could see a lot of people changing their minds. And I totally understand that. So I think both matter, right? I obviously think that both matter. I mean, one of the reasons why I like libertarianism so much is because I think the consequences of it are so positive for people today and for people in the future and going forward for as long as there are going to be people in the world. And I think there will be people in the world longer if there's libertarianism than without it, right? But I think we need to talk about, both of those, because you could say, listen, the principles say that we should have free immigration. People should be allowed to move across borders without hindrance. However, the consequences of this may be really bad. So maybe we need to tweak this principle just a little bit in this direction so we can capture most of these benefits and adhere to our principles most of the time, but make it so that the consequences are much, much better than they otherwise would be. And so I'm fine like having some small compromises here or there about that if we are convinced the consequences would be worse than what we want.
Yeah. Okay. Do you find it surprising that you're having to make this argument to libertarians?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I do actually think it's surprising because I don't have to make this argument about other issues that I think are just as complicated and fraught with libertarians, right? So like drug legalization, right? Like I think just about every libertarian I've ever met wants to legalize drugs.
Yeah.
And they want to legalize drugs regardless of any other changes in public policy made, right? And so I think if drugs were legalized, more people would do drugs more frequently, because you'd increase the supply of drugs and the price would fall. And that would happen even though we still have like Medicare and Medicaid and all these like government interventions and health insurance. I think that there would be higher health insurance and higher health costs because there'd be a few more overdoses. And some of those people don't have health insurance. They go to the hospital, they would use emergency Medicaid. And as a result, like government expenditures will go up just a little bit, at least in that one small way, right? Well, I don't think that I need to say like, okay, we need to get rid of the welfare state and we need to get rid of government intervention in every sphere of the health insurance industry and the government supply of healthcare and the FDA in order to legalize fentanyl. I don't think I need to say that. And I don't think libertarians demand that. And I've never gotten that from libertarians. But when it comes to immigration, I get a lot of people with a million caveats saying, well, first we need to get rid of all the welfare state. We need to get rid of taxes. We need to get rid of this and that and the other thing to have freer immigration, which I think it's absurd, like the hoops that we need to jump through to show that free immigration is good, whereas no other libertarians demand it for any other public policy issue. It tells me that a lot of these folks just don't agree with the principle of free immigration, even though they call themselves libertarian, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody has their sort of like, well, I'm like 99% libertarian, and they have that one issue. It's like, I'm mostly there. I mean, you can kind of afford people that to some extent. I mean, I realize it's different when you're out there debating a topic and you're defending it. I understand that. But from a practical perspective, I can personally see why some are just not quite on board. I know a lot of people, it being anti-war was the last thing that went with their libertarianism. Immigration is it for some. Shoot, I just lost my train of thought on what it was. But a lot of it is about they are worried about some sort of either catastrophic or just measurable disruption to either their well-being or their lives. And so there's that emotional component of like, well, if this happens, what does this mean? And I wonder if, and how much do you think of this shift in libertarian conversation, which has gone somewhat, I don't want to say it's gone somewhat rightward, but because, libertarians, a lot of them voted for Trump, and there are a lot of libertarians who are less in favor of immigration than you and I are, than the classic position is. Is it a reaction to what happened under Biden? And they forget that, a previous era, it was all fine.
So, my problem with this, this argument for libertarians is that they don't apply it consistently.
Yeah.
So that's my problem with that exception, right? I think everybody has exceptions to libertarianism or whatever they believe. Like, for instance, I'm glad that they banned like lead in the environment because the externalities are so large. But I would consider that for anything where the externalities are really large and damaging and on third parties, right?
Yeah.
But why did some libertarians go in that direction? I think there was a strain of libertarianism where they sort of confused populism and being anti-elites with being pro-liberty. And that is just simply not true, right? Like, I think like Ron Paul sort of blended both of those pretty well, where he was, anti-elites, anti-Washington, and he had that rhetoric, but he was pro-liberty. And I think a lot of libertarians confuse this anti-elite rhetoric with actually being pro-liberty. Yep. And they're not. It's lazy, it's foolish, and I see it out there all the time. I also think a lot of libertarians are just like confused about, conservatives and conservatism. I think they're basically mostly conservatives or mostly Republicans. And they go along with Donald Trump for that reason. And I don't think they really think that deeply about it. And so I don't think that there's just like not a world out there where I think Dave Smith would not have supported Donald Trump. Like, I just don't think that
well,
exists.
If the election were held this month, he might not have, since he's finally renounced on it.
Yeah, well, if he had to consider, openly and publicly, people are making arguments to him, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Because you'd still have all the other issues, like, oh, well, what about Kamala Harris and trans issues, or what about Kamala Harris and immigration issues? And well, are we sure like Kamala Harris probably would have bombed Iran too? Because look at Joe Biden gave Israel everything they wanted. I mean, like, if it were actual choice again, like, maybe you're right, and maybe I'm being too critical of him, but it's not so sure to me. And by the way, I always that argument that like Joe Biden that the Republicans are like the peacenik party, it was like absurd. Like, maybe I'm too old. Like, I'm 40, but I remember it was always the Democrats who were skeptical of the war. It was they were the ones who were skeptical of Bush. They've been skeptical for years. They were called traitors by the Republicans. The Republicans still talk tough. And Joe Biden and like Donald Trump was never some peacenik. So I don't know how they were able to convince themselves that Donald Trump is like the peace candidate. I don't get it.
Yeah. The week we're recording this, the Reason Roundtable had an episode. I just thought it was my favorite headline or title of a podcast episode. Anti-war president starts new war. Period. Again. Period. Yeah. And I'm just like, yep. Well, that about sums it up. But
anti-war president elected to the war party starts war, and the thing is, and this is the proof, by the way, is the war powers resolution that Doug Massey helped introduce. Do you know how many Republican co-signers there were?
No.
0. It was like 46 Democrats though. So the idea that there's just like this latent anti-war republicanism out there, I mean, it's just like so divorced from reality.
Well, I mean, to give a little bit of credit, I think there is a sense in which the party, the traditional Republican Party, is not the same since Donald Trump, and now that we're in that. And also, there are a lot of people who I know absolutely voted for Trump. I mean, I've seen them online who are very much against the bombing and the wars.
We're in bubbles, man.
What's
we're
that?
In bubbles. You and I are in bubbles. Okay, like we are in extreme intellectual bubbles. You talk to like a normal Republican who probably doesn't talk to any libertarians ever, even thinks about it.
Okay,
they love it, dude.
Well, yeah, all right.
They love the war. I'm sorry. I wish it had changed. I really do. But some things have changed in the GOP, but that ain't one of them.
All right.
I'm sorry, man.
No, it's all good. You're going to burst my bubble here just to keep the metaphor going, I suppose. Let's talk a little bit about some of the objections that are fairly common. And one of them Dave brought up in the debate, which is this whole allegedly voluntarious, which as a position, I think he got a little bit in reverse. That I don't want to, so you don't have a right to make me associate with people that I don't want to associate with. And so therefore, and the American people are all saying this, therefore we shouldn't just allow anybody who wants to come here. And I'm like, well, you don't have to associate with them. Is my thought of like, look, you don't have to hire them. You don't have to visit their businesses. If you don't want to buy their food truck food, you don't have to do that. Where is this violating voluntarious? And so those are some of the objections. But I don't know what the more sophisticated response to that is, other than like, well, don't associate with them, just like you want to not.
Yeah. So I think that argument, which was made most famously by Hans Hermann Hoppe, is this idea that Americans somehow have a collective property right in the United States, and therefore, if a majority of voters don't want something, then it would be a violation of our property rights to allow it. So in my mind, it's like just absurd, and it could justify any anti-libertarian policy.
Yes.
Like, okay, most Americans don't want private property in firearms. Well, it's a violation, therefore, of property rights to have firearms because Americans don't want it on this collective space, right? And I don't think I'm being unfair characterizing it that way. I think it's a very backwards collectivist argument. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Now, I thought the more sophisticated one that Dave made was that, okay, well, the government owns the roads. And therefore, if the government owns the roads, they can set how to use those roads.
Yeah.
And that could mean not allowing people who are, immigrants to use those roads, maybe because they didn't pay for them. Well, okay, that's interesting, right? In the same way that the government can kick people off of the roads if they're not using them as roads, right? Like if you pitch a tent in the middle of the road. And I'm like, okay, well, one, that's never been like an issue. Like we had open borders in the 19th century or free immigration in the 19th century. And there was never this principle that like, well, immigrants can pitch tents in the middle of public roads and we can't do anything about it. Like, of course not. Like it's a government owned resource. Unfortunately, it should be privatized, but roads, there's nothing that requires that or is even consistent with that. And secondly, children don't pay the costs of the roads. Nobody, you and I didn't pay the fixed cost of roads. Do I need to pay some certain amount of taxes before I can travel the road? Well, this is an argument for tolls, but there's a gas tax. There's a toll road by my house. Can immigrants use the toll road but not the other road? There's a gas tax. Everybody who buys gas pays for the highways. If you pay the sales tax and a local city or a property tax, you're paying for some amount of the roads. So I just think it's like a confusion over how public property actually works.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think it's very convincing in any kind of way.
Here's the thing that I thought of, I think in sort of reflecting on the debate, I did a live stream with Jacob Winograd on this. And what occurred to me was like, well, let's even say that, grant that argument for a second. What on earth defines what the will of the American people is?
Yes.
And Dave's response was, well, they elected Donald Trump, and the polls are saying that they are overwhelmingly against the problems that the Biden administration had created with immigration. So it's like, okay, that's one way to discern what the will of the people is. You brought up the idea that like people want to hire them. Okay, well, which one? Like, there's no definitive way to say, okay, the will of the American people is X. We don't want them, and therefore that's what the law ought to be, because there's a conflicting amount of information going on, right? Like, yes, fine. People say, well, this is the other problem. People say with their vote, I don't want the chaos at the border, which is probably the most accurate way of putting it, as opposed to I don't want immigrants in my town. That may be true, but that's not the most accurate way of saying that's why people voted that way. They just don't want chaos. But maybe they don't actually, we all know this. We could pull out Myth of the Rational Voter right here behind me from Kaplan. Most people don't actually know what would make their lives better. I know Dave doesn't like that argument, but there is a sense in which their actual behavior is acting against how they voted. And that's, a way of saying, actually, they really do want immigrants here. They just don't realize it because they're acting in ways that say they want immigrants here.
Yeah, I mean, like, if somebody like Dave, who lives in New York City, as I understand it, like, doesn't like immigrants, then what the heck is he doing in New York City, which is 40% foreign born, right? Like, if you don't want to associate with immigrants, then there's something you can do, which is called move away.
Yeah.
And you don't have to move even that far away from New York City to get to places where there really aren't that many immigrants to be able to live and move. So I do think that people's individual action speaks a lot louder than their voting behavior, than the voting behavior of a small number of them every several years. And then secondly, I think what you said, right, is correct. Like, how do we discern this will? Like, he's really sort of digging in to the economic calculation argument. He's trying to make these ideas that, like, the notion that like we can centrally plan the population of the United States and the movement of people across borders based on a non-market mechanism, which is people voting every once in a while. And that's just not going to lead to efficient results. Oh yeah, it's very it's frankly a very socialist way of trying to view and plan the allocation of scarce resources.
Yeah.
And it's not going to lead to efficient results. And it's certainly not consistent with libertarianism. So I just have like, I find the argument like so bewilderingly bad that is almost like crazy. Like, I think there are better arguments, frankly, against free immigration than that from a libertarian perspective.
But it's funny. That's actually my next question.
Oh,
Steel
well,
manning. Seriously, like what are the ones that are like you could like, nod your head and be like, okay, I can maybe be convinced of that given enough time, or better
the
data.
evidence.
What's the steel man for the case against immigration restriction?
Or so I think that the case for restrictions, right, is so I did say something like this. Most immigrants from countries where there's less freedom, less capitalism, than the United States. And if enough of them come in sufficient numbers, then they could bring with them whatever it is that produces that lack of freedom. So it could be like their voting, it could be their culture, it could be whatever it is, right?
Yeah, right.
And as a result of that, everybody could be less free in the future than they otherwise would be. It could undermine economic growth. It could undermine freedom if we spread these like bad institutions everywhere around the world, because freedom is ultimately fairly rare in the scope of human history. It's fairly rare today. And in a disproportionate amount of our advancements as a species comes from places where freedom exists. So if we undermine that, then could be a disaster, right? So that I think is a steel man argument, or the best argument against it.
Okay. Yeah, but my initial impulse, and this is a little bit sarcastic, is like, well, yeah, but that's the same impulse to like we need a population boom of like, look, you're gonna have a bunch of 18 years of freeloaders if we have an immigration boom. So that's a bunch of socialists that you're sorry, I was just
it's true.
Freeloading socialists as our children. So
no, I mean I think it's an argument that it could be true. If the data were different, the evidence were different, that would convince me to have some level of immigration restrictions.
Okay.
The thing is, the evidence doesn't support that.
Is it debatable, marginal, or is it just a theory?
It's a theory. The evidence that we have either pushes in the opposite direction or there's no effect.
Okay.
Is basically what we find. So what's interesting is on the opposite direction, we kind of see this in the 19th century and early 20th century in the United States, and across the world in some other countries. And my dominant theory is that what immigration does is it kills labor unions, prevents their formation, and undermines those that exist. Mm-hmm. And labor unions are some of the most successful organizations that politically lobby and support expansions in state power, expansions in the welfare state, and restrictions on free markets. And so by undermining labor unions, immigrants, unintentionally and accidentally support freedom. Or at least make it a lot harder for people who oppose freedom to get what they want. And that, I think, is one of these ways in which there's like a counter, like immigration sort of counters certain pressure for more statism.
What data do we have on the children of immigrants' political views as they come of age and are able to vote? And is that any different from native-born populations?
So we have data from the General Social Survey. It's the largest biennial survey in the United States. People, it's 60,000 people every 2 years, and they ask tons of questions about your opinions and also where you're from, where your parents are from, your grandparents, etc. And what we find is that across public policy issues, including the issue of immigration, their opinions are basically no different than fourth plus generation Americans on basically every public policy issue. Sometimes a little bit freer, sometimes a little bit less free. But basically, the good news is that they're no different. And the bad news is that they're no different because Americans have pretty bad opinions of public policy.
So you can't make the argument that immigrants will make us a more libertarian society by virtue of that being a libertarian thing.
They definitely won't, just by virtue of their opinions and expressing them in the ballot box. No, they will not make us a more libertarian society, unfortunately.
Yeah. Does that data differ by geography? Like the immigrants that end up in California just look like Californians, and Texas look like Texans, et cetera?
The sample size isn't big enough to do it by state.
Okay.
So I can't say that. But what is interesting is people who were born in the state of Texas and still live in Texas and vote there, majority of them vote Democratic. But the overwhelming percentage of people who are from from outside of Texas, including other states, they vote Republican. And that includes like international. Now, I don't know if the international people separately from the Americans from other states vote Republican. I don't know. I can't tell that. I don't think it's probably as extreme, right? Because I think the person from California who moves to Texas is more likely to be Republican than the person from Vietnam who moves to Texas, right? But that's one of the things that we do see in Texas. Texas would be a blue state if it weren't for the people from outside of Texas coming there to vote.
Gotcha. All right. I have one more question. What do you think the future of the immigration debate in the libertarian movement is going to be?
Well, I think it will probably be more pro-immigration, because I think what people are starting to realize is that with this president's actions, with ICE agents who are masked, going around the country, arresting people, many of whom are American citizens by accident or green card holders, under like very odd and suspicious police state tactics. If libertarians don't oppose that, then I think they will realize how absurd they look, how absurd they sound, in the same way that like libertarians who are pro-war in like 2002 and 2003 were beginning to look absurd. So I think we're going to have like a couple years of debate about this, but in a couple years, people are going to come around, like libertarians are going to come around and be like, yeah, you know what? Supporting the domestic police state is pretty anti-libertarian. And that's going to be obvious in retrospect, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
It's funny that it has to be obvious in retrospect, because it's kind of like one of the core principles of big state government, or being against government as a libertarian. So
I think it's obvious too. For whatever it's worth, I think it's obvious. But this is like a generational turnover thing, right? Like you have a lot of older libertarians who are more supportive of war, like Randy Barnett, for instance, who loves war, is really supportive of it. And they never really changed their mind, and they seem kind of silly now. And we're going to have another generational turnover where some people just like didn't realize that, hey, the new way in which state power is exercised and that restrains our freedom is through domestic immigration enforcement.
Alex Nowrasteh, thank you so much for joining me for this episode, for this conversation about immigration. It's one of my most important favorite topics to talk about, and it obviously is one of yours. So hopefully I'll get to see you again soon. And thanks for joining us.
Doug, thanks a bunch for having me. I appreciate it.